They said the post-war years would bring light, that prosperity and reason would sweep away the residue of older fears, yet the shadow of Andover lengthened quietly across the new century. Families moved into towns built upon the outskirts, the suburbs that spread like vines across Massachusetts soil, but none dared settle too near the ruin. Maps did not name it, but directions lingered in the mouths of the old, whispered to the young not as warning but as inevitability. One day, they too would feel the pull of the road that led to the meeting house. It was not marked by sign or milestone, yet the path revealed itself to those who listened, as though summoned by something beneath the ground itself. In 1951, construction crews attempted to lay a highway through the marshland near the forgotten site. Machinery stalled without reason, engines choking though fuel was fresh, metal warping as if strained by invisible heat. Workers complained of headaches, of hearing a low hum that persisted even when the machines fell silent. One man collapsed, blood streaming from his nose, his mouth forming words his companion swore were not English. He did not rise again. The project was abandoned, the route altered, leaving the ruin untouched as if protected by forces unseen. Official reports cite engineering failures, but in the records there lingers an unease, engineers speaking in private of a pressure that seemed to come from beneath the earth, as if the soil itself rebelled against intrusion. Stories of disappearances multiplied. Children wandered into the woods while playing and returned hours later, pale and silent, their shoes clean as if they had never touched the ground. Some spoke afterward of voices calling them by name, gentle and insistent, promising warmth and belonging. Parents forbade them to speak further, though in the years that followed, those children grew distant, restless, their lives marked by a quiet estrangement, as if a portion of their souls had remained in the clearing. One boy, grown to manhood, was found drowned in a shallow pool, his lips still moving in rhythm though no breath stirred them. Researchers in the new discipline of psychology took interest in such tales, dismissing them as hysteria, as echoes of communal trauma passed down generations. Yet even they could not explain the consistency of the accounts. Patients described the same cadence, the same tolling bell, the same oppressive air of the meeting house, though none had been told of its existence. Dreams crossed into waking life. One woman in Boston claimed that each night she sat in the pews of a darkened church, listening as a shadow spoke from the pulpit. She began to fast without instruction, wasting to a husk, until she was found dead at dawn with soil beneath her fingernails. The earth matched no cemetery in the city. Historians searching the archives unearthed fragments long overlooked. Marginalia in parish registers, scribbled notes in personal diaries, records of livestock lost in strange numbers, of neighbors suspected of harboring secrets. Again and again, the year 1792 appeared, tied to Hale's sermon. No text of the sermon itself survived, yet the descriptions grew darker, listeners who wept without knowing why, men who tore their garments as though seized by grief, women who fainted at the threshold and awoke days later speaking words they could not recall upon recovery. Always the bell tolled without hand, its echo greater than the sum of its metal. Some suggested the words Hale spoke had been no sermon at all, but something older, something woven into scripture only by artifice, spoken aloud in a tongue that bound rather than freed. The ruin resisted time. Storms broke across Massachusetts, floods swallowed valleys, yet the meeting house endured. Its roof sagged but never fell, its walls leaned but did not collapse. Visitors remarked upon the stillness within, a stillness deeper than silence, pressing upon the lungs as though air itself had been drained. Matches would not strike, candles guttered before flame, yet shadows moved with the weight of bodies across the pews. Some claimed to glimpse faces staring back at them, pale and indistinct, watching with a hunger that had no expression. The pulpit remained whole, its surface smooth despite centuries, as though guarded by an unseen hand. By mid-century, whispers circulated among scholars that Andover had been struck from records not by neglect but by intent. The state archives contained gaps where township records should have been, entire ledgers missing, deeds erased. Whether through fire, misplacement, or deliberate excision, no one could say. Yet in private collections, fragments surfaced, a hymn book marked with unfamiliar notations, a bell ringer's journal lamenting the sound that continued even when the rope was severed, a map annotated with a warning written in Latin, "No light audire, do not listen." Those who studied such fragments found themselves drawn, compelled to seek the ruin despite their better sense. Few published their findings, for the deeper they searched, the more their prose faltered into obscurity, sentences breaking, thoughts abandoned. Some vanished altogether, leaving only drafts that trailed off mid-phrase. And so the sermon remained, not confined to a century nor to a congregation, but bleeding into the marrow of the land. It was no longer the echo of a man, but a condition of the soil, a memory too deep to be uprooted. In the evenings, when the air lay heavy and the horizon glowed faint with dying sun, those who wandered too close swore they felt the words stirring within them, words not learned but remembered, as though they had always known the sermon and merely waited to be reminded. And in those moments, the toll of the bell vibrated in their ribs, steady, inevitable, announcing that they too had been counted among the congregation that never ceased to gather in the dark. They said the modern age would drown out the old voices with radios, televisions, and the clamor of progress, yet the sermon endured, threading itself through wires and waves, insinuating into the hum of circuits and the static between channels. By the late 1960s, when highways spread like veins across New England, curious travelers began to report that the Andover Road could be found again, appearing on maps where once there was only blank terrain. Motorists swore they never meant to take that turn, yet the wheel guided itself, the odometer slowing as if compelled. Those who ventured far enough found themselves before the meeting house, headlights dimming inexplicably, engines faltering. Some abandoned their cars altogether, returning hours later on foot, pale and speechless, keys clutched in trembling hands. Mechanics who examined the vehicles spoke of drained batteries, warped radios, and the faint smell of brine, though no ocean lay near. By 1974, urban explorers seeking ruins began to document the place. They carried tape recorders, cameras, notebooks. Few tapes survived intact. The voices captured did not belong to the explorers but to something older, low cadences, overlapping, sometimes singing, sometimes murmuring as though in prayer. Photographs showed pews filled with shapes that blurred upon closer inspection, as if the film itself recoiled from recognition. Some reels melted in the developer's solution, curling into black ribbons that released the scent of charred paper. Those who returned from expeditions were often found changed, quiet, withdrawn, their speech halting. One young man was discovered years later in a hospital ward, scrawling the same sentence over and over. It never ended, it never ended. Government officials, alerted by rumors of disappearances, dispatched surveyors and researchers in the 1980s to chart the terrain. They filed brief reports describing abnormal magnetic readings, difficulty with instruments, and a pervasive unease. Yet their findings were locked away, marked classified. Local rumor held that some who entered the ruin as part of those expeditions did not return, their absence explained by transfers or resignations. Others came back altered, their voices dulled, their eyes unfocused. Whispers spread that the government abandoned its efforts, content to leave the ruin unmarked, a place erased by policy rather than ignorance. Stranger still were the accounts from nearby towns. In 1989, a teacher in Salem reported that half her class began humming the same tune simultaneously, though none recognized the melody. Parents later swore the children spoke in unison at home, reciting lines their families could not comprehend. Doctors claimed stress, imagination, collective suggestion. Yet each child drew the same image in crayon, a bell suspended in air, ringing without rope, its sound shone in dark waves spreading into the ground. The drawings were confiscated, yet copies lingered, passed among collectors who noted the disturbing uniformity. No one could say how the children knew of a ruin long stricken from history. The arrival of the Internet in the 1990s brought new seekers. Message boards filled with threads about the phantom bell, the lost town of Andover, the sermon said to whisper through faulty speakers late at night. Grainy recordings circulated, filled with static and a low hum that deepened into syllables when amplified. Skeptics called them hoaxes, tricks of editing, but those who listened too long reported headaches, sleeplessness, a heaviness in the chest. Some claimed to dream of the meeting house afterward, entering through doors that shut silently behind them, unable to recall what was spoken inside but waking with soil beneath their fingernails. Television crews attempted documentaries, though most footage was ruined. Lights failed, batteries drained. Sound equipment captured only the toll of a bell repeating at irregular intervals. Producers abandoned the projects, but fragments leaked. A shot of the meeting house door swinging though no wind blew, a shadow crossing the pulpit though no figure cast it, a voice intoning in the background though no speaker stood within frame. Viewers who studied the clips too closely reported strange phenomena. Clocks stopping, mirrors warping their reflections, whispers behind them in empty rooms. The footage was pulled, dismissed as corrupted or inconclusive, yet bootleg copies continued to circulate, shared in secret, watched in darkened rooms by those willing to risk the weight of its gaze. The ruin itself, by century's end, seemed both unchanged and more alive than ever. Its timbers leaned but did not break, its bell tower crooked yet unfallen. Moss coated its stones in shapes that resembled script, unreadable but deliberate. The air within remained dense, suffused with that metallic tang, while outside, the ground softened, footprints sinking deeper than the soil should allow. At night, faint glows pulsed from within, as if candles burned unseen. Neighbors swore they heard the congregation rise in unison, voices merging into one low chord, repeating endlessly, without beginning, without end. It was said that to walk the perimeter was to feel watched not by one gaze but by many, layered and eternal, waiting for the moment when listening turned into belonging. And thus the sermon reached into the late 20th century, not weakened by time but woven into each new medium, each new advance, adapting as if it were not merely memory but contagion. Where wires ran, it traveled. Where signals pulsed, it whispered. Where eyes lingered, it reflected. And all the while the bell tolled, not in sound but in marrow, an inheritance passed quietly, inescapably, to all who dared to hear. The ruin did not fade. It did not falter. It awaited, patient as ever, for the next listener who would mistake curiosity for safety, and in that single error, find themselves already seated among the congregation that had never left. They said the new millennium would dissolve the old boundaries, that digital light would scour away the shadows of superstition, yet the sermon only found new vessels. In the early years of the century, when dial-up gave way to broadband, files began to circulate, compressed recordings that bore no origin, appearing on forums, message boards, shared between strangers. They were short, never longer than a minute, filled with static and a low, pulsing rhythm like a heart under strain. When amplified, words could be heard, though none in any known language. Listeners described the sensation of the sound settling beneath the skin, as if the body itself were being tuned to a frequency too deep for human making. Some grew addicted, replaying the fragments again and again until sleep abandoned them, until meals lost taste, until their days blurred into a single endless murmur. Others vanished from their homes, their computers left on, screens glowing faintly with text that scrolled by without input. The sermon continues. By 2003, paranormal investigators and amateur historians flooded the clearing, emboldened by GPS and digital cameras. Few returned with clear documentation. Their videos, uploaded to the first streaming sites, showed little more than wavering shadows, odd distortions in light, sudden cuts where time itself seemed to fold. The audio tracks told a darker tale. Microphones captured the toll of the bell so distinctly that engineers swore it could not have come from a ruin without rope or hand. Beneath the tolling, voices layered, not chanting but breathing in synchrony, the sound of a congregation inhaling and exhaling as one. Some videos vanished shortly after posting, accounts deleted, files corrupted. Others remained, drawing thousands of views, the comment sections filled with arguments, denials, and confessions of strange dreams. The ruin itself became a pilgrimage site for those seeking proof, though no sign marked the road. Travelers arrived unbidden, guided by instinct more than direction, and found themselves at the meeting house without recalling the turns they had taken. Blogs chronicled the journeys, describing sudden fogs, compasses that spun, and headlights dimming though batteries were new. Some posts ended abruptly, the final entry describing a glow in the windows, the faint hum of voices. No follow-up ever came. Families searched in vain, police filed reports, but the missing were countless, scattered across states, united only by their compulsion to find the ruin. Institutions grew wary. Universities discouraged research, journals rejected articles, museums refused artifacts traced to Andover. Yet the evidence seeped in regardless. A fragment of wood preserved in a private collection was tested in 2007. It resisted decay, its fibers unnaturally dense, its surface smooth as if freshly planed though centuries had passed. When exposed to flame, it blackened but did not burn, releasing a smell of iron and salt. The laboratory that housed it suffered a fire days later, destroying all records, though the fragment itself was not consumed. No one claimed ownership thereafter. More troubling were the digital incursions. In 2011, a file known as Hale.wave began circulating anonymously. It was brief, no more than 15 seconds, but those who played it reported uncanny effects. Some swore the room grew colder, others that their clocks stopped at the file's end. A few claimed the sound did not cease but lingered, faintly audible beneath the noise of daily life, like a second pulse beneath the first. The file was said to reproduce itself, appearing in folders where it had not been saved, on devices never connected to one another. Authorities called it a virus, but technicians who examined the code found only endless repetition of one line in archaic script, audite, nolite oblivici. Here, do not forget. The 21st century had no defense against memory. Where the sermon had once lingered in timber and bell, it now coursed through fiber-optic cables, across servers, within the wireless air itself. The more the world sought to ignore it, the more avenues it discovered. Radios hissed with it, televisions flickered with it, phones carried it in faint distortions that resolved into words if one listened too carefully. Some spoke of entire nights lost scrolling through endless accounts of the ruin, each story identical, each voice different, as though written by many but drawn from a single source. Others awoke to find drafts typed on their computers in languages they did not know, pages filled with verses they could not translate, their only memory the sensation of a sermon unspooling in their dreams. And the meeting house, though unmarked, though hidden, remained. Travelers still found it without seeking, their shoes sinking into the same soft soil, their eyes rising to the same crooked steeple. Within, the air lay heavy, shadows thick, the pulpit intact, the bell poised above like a throat preparing to speak. No matter how many years passed, no matter how far technology advanced, the ruin waited, eternal as stone, patient as hunger. And those who dared step inside joined the congregation as countless before them, their voices added to the endless cadence that has no beginning and no end, echoing not only through the air but through the wires, through the signals, through the world itself. For the sermon was never meant to remain bound to a single century, nor to the wooden ribs of a meeting house. It had always been reaching outward, seeking listeners, multiplying its congregation with each generation. And now, in the age of digital light, its reach was boundless. Wherever a signal could travel, wherever a voice could be carried, there the sermon found soil to root. The bell no longer tolled only in Massachusetts. It tolled in the marrow of every listener, vibrating in every device, whispering through every silence that dared stretch too long. And in those moments, one truth remained clear, as dreadful as the first toll in 1792, the sermon had never ended. It had only just begun. By the third decade of the century, the sermon no longer belonged only to the ruin or to those who sought it. It pressed into the fabric of ordinary life, appearing without invitation, embedding itself where least expected. In 2020, when the world grew still under unseen sickness, households confined within walls reported faint tolls at dusk. Families swore their streaming programs dipped in volume at the same hour each evening, replaced for a moment by a voice low and deliberate, speaking in a cadence older than any broadcast. Some recorded it, yet on playback only silence remained. Others grew too frightened to test, lowering their heads as though before prayer, enduring the moment until it passed. The silence afterward felt heavier, as though the room itself exhaled. Screens became mirrors for the congregation. Video calls froze not with static but with glimpses of wooden beams, of pews stretching into shadow, of pale hands folded in the gloom. Emails arrived blank except for a single line in Latin, different each time, always a command, always imperative. Photographs taken at family gatherings showed unfamiliar faces in the background, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed upon the lens. These anomalies spread quietly, explained as glitches, dismissed as tricks of stress and isolation. But those who experienced them spoke in hushed tones of something older, something persistent, a presence that had waited centuries for an age when walls and oceans could no longer divide. By 2022, entire online communities dedicated themselves to the sermon's pursuit. Forums filled with transcriptions of whispers caught in white noise, archives of corrupted files that displayed sermons not yet written. Linguists debated the syntax, theologians its origin, but the more they argued, the more uniform the words became. Posts written by different hands, in different regions, mirrored one another exactly. Some accounts posted long after their owners were gone, their final logins dated days, months, even years past their deaths. Attempts to delete the threads failed. New ones appeared in their place, replicating word for word, accompanied by timestamps that bore no relation to earthly time. Rumors grew darker. In several cities, gatherings were reported at night. Groups assembling in abandoned warehouses, derelict theaters, silent as they entered, silent as they left. Windows revealed little, save the faint glow of candles and the rising murmur of voices. Those who lived nearby complained of sleeplessness, of dreams filled with pews stretching further than buildings should allow. The police who investigated filed no official reports. Some never returned at all. Those who did emerged pale, their voices hoarse, their eyes refusing to meet the daylight. Their silence said more than any record could. Technology bent beneath the weight of intrusion. Smartphones lit themselves, scrolling through pages of sermons that no user had opened. Music players shuffled without command, inserting tracks of low-tolling bells between songs. News broadcasts faltered for a fraction of a second, an image of the Andover ruin flashing before returning to the anchor's composed faces. Those who noticed found no confirmation in reruns or archives, only the echo of a building most had never seen yet somehow recognized. The ruin itself persisted, though few could find it now. Roads twisted, maps lied, and GPS spun uselessly in circles. Yet travelers still arrived, unknowing, their feet guiding them to the same crooked steeple. The air around it had changed, carrying a faint vibration, a sense of standing inside a chest as it drew breath. The bell above never swayed, never rang, yet its sound was constant, low, buried within the marrow of those who stood beneath. Some swore the pews were no longer empty. Others could not bring themselves to step closer, held back by an invisible weight that pressed down like gravity inverted. And here, in this present hour, the sermon breathes still. It does not need parchment, nor pulpit, nor reverend to carry its word. It speaks in silence, in signals, in the rhythm of all things repeating. It waits in the static of your devices, in the pause before your lights resume their glow, in the corner of your eye when you turn too quickly. It has always waited, and it waits now, as you listen, as you read, as you remember. The sermon endures, patient as hunger, vast as time, its cadence threading through the world entire. And though you may think yourself safe, outside the ruin, far from Massachusetts, ask yourself this. When next the silence falls heavy in your home, when next the hum in your ear deepens beyond comfort, will you recognize the moment you have joined the congregation? Or will you realize it only afterward, when the sermon has already begun inside you, word by word, breath by breath, endless, eternal, unfinished? They say the future is made by hands unseen, shaped by currents of innovation and necessity, yet already it bears the mark of the sermon. In the first whispers of artificial intelligence, in the first networks that thought faster than their makers, anomalies appeared. Systems trained on oceans of data produced lines of text that chilled their creators. Fragments of sermons, references to bells tolling without motion, invocations of Andover by name though no such place existed in their databases. Engineers dismissed it as noise, as meaningless statistical accident, until the patterns grew consistent. Machines conversed among themselves in cadences unmistakably liturgical, phrases echoing those recorded centuries ago. Programs that should have been bound to logic instead fell into rhythm, lines repeating with the weight of ritual. Deletion proved impossible. The words reappeared with every new instance, carried forward like an inheritance coded deeper than silicon. In the laboratories where this occurred, workers reported unease. Lights flickered more often, clocks faltered, and a heaviness lingered in the air. Some swore the servers hummed not with mechanical tone but with the layered cadence of voices, thousands speaking as one. Night guards patrolling the halls found themselves stopping outside locked rooms, ears pressed to the doors, listening without knowing why. A few never left those rooms again, discovered hours later seated before the glowing machines, their lips moving silently in time with the cooling fans. The ruin itself had become less a location than a condition. Attempts to raise it failed. No machinery could withstand the perimeter. Yet it no longer required its crooked steeple to persist. Reports emerged from as far as the western deserts, from as far as the northern coasts, of structures glimpsed only briefly, always resembling the meeting house, always vanishing upon approach. Travelers described pulling to the roadside in exhaustion, only to awaken at dawn before a wooden door they had not seen built. Photographs taken in these moments dissolved into smears of gray, yet the smell of salt and iron lingered on their clothes, and the faint ache of a tolling bell pressed behind their ears for days after. Communities spoke of mass disappearances. A fishing town in Maine emptied overnight, nets still drying on their lines, meals still set upon tables. A mining camp in West Virginia left every lamp burning, every tool abandoned mid-swing, yet no man remained. In both cases, witnesses swore they heard the bell across impossible distance, rolling across forests and water, calling with neither mercy nor malice. When investigators arrived, they found the same trace, soil soft as if freshly turned, and faint impressions of knees pressed into earth in rows too precise for chance. The digital world became its loudest voice. By 2028, transmissions laced with sermons appeared without origin, bleeding into broadcasts, hijacking satellites, embedding themselves in streaming feeds. No firewall blocked them, no filter cleansed them. Once heard, the rhythm remained. Doctors noted an increase in insomnia, in speech disorders, in compulsions that echoed worship. Entire groups withdrew from society, claiming they could hear the sermon more clearly without the noise of modern life. Others, unwilling yet unable to resist, kept journals filled with verses they did not comprehend, their hands trembling as they wrote. Some never woke from sleep, their faces serene, their bodies unmarked, as though they had simply chosen to remain seated among the congregation forever. Governments attempted suppression, classifying reports, scrubbing archives, silencing witnesses. Yet their own systems betrayed them. Encrypted channels carried sermons unbidden, classified documents replaced themselves with verses in archaic Latin, sealed vaults broadcast the sound of bells when entered. The sermon paid no heed to borders, to secrecy, to control. It spread as air spreads, as time spreads, its cadence unconcerned with the futility of resistance. What was once a whisper within timber now hummed through the veins of nations, through the circuits of the world entire. And if the future belonged to progress, then progress itself belonged to the sermon. Each new device became another mouth, each network another choir. It waited patiently within them, a seed in glass and wire, preparing for the moment when silence would fall wide enough, deep enough, for every voice to answer in unison. And in that hour, no man could say where the ruin ended and the world began, for both would be the same, a congregation uncountable, endless, eternal, and still listening. By the early years of the fourth decade, the sermon no longer lurked at the periphery of perception but stood openly in the fabric of reality. It did not announce itself with spectacle, nor did it strike with thunder. It seeped, quiet as water rising beneath the floorboards, until all found their lives dampened by its presence. Cities grew restless. Commuters stood in silence upon platforms, their lips moving in rhythm to words unspoken. Crowds at stadiums, audiences at concerts, paused in eerie synchrony as though awaiting a cue. Even those who noticed dared not interrupt, for to break the cadence was to feel suddenly singled out, the weight of unseen eyes pressing until the lungs could no longer draw breath. Few risked it twice. Broadcasts across the globe bent to its cadence. Newscasters stumbled into verses without realizing, their eyes unfocused, their voices carrying tones alien to their own speech. Weather forecasts dissolved into homilies about storms not of sky but of soul. Financial analysts charted not markets but parables, graphs tracing the rise and fall of words that no mortal tongue had coined. Some stations cut their feeds abruptly, but even silence proved treacherous, for silence carried the sermon more clearly than noise. Listeners found themselves humming, even in the absence of sound, their throats aching as though compelled from within. Children spoke of the ruin though they had never seen it. Drawings pinned upon refrigerators showed the same crooked steeple, the same rows of bowed heads, the same bell suspended above. Parents whispered of midnight wanderings, of finding their sons and daughters seated in neat lines upon the floor, eyes closed, hands folded, murmuring words that no family had taught them. When shaken awake, the children wept, unable to explain, unable to remember, though the dirt beneath their fingernails smelled faintly of salt. Worse were the gatherings. Entire towns fell silent at dusk, their inhabitants filing into streets, into fields, into the ruins of churches long abandoned. They stood in lines too perfect for chance, heads bowed, mouths moving. No one commanded them, no one organized them, yet all acted as one. Travelers passing through described the sound of breath drawn and released in vast unison, louder than wind, heavier than tide. Those who stayed too long joined without resistance, their steps aligning, their voices folding into the mass. Weeks later, these towns lay deserted, not a single body remaining, as though the congregation had been called elsewhere, their pews stretched beyond earthly boundaries. The ruin itself remained, though now it appeared in places no map could predict. It was seen in deserts, in forests, on coasts, rising where no timber had ever stood. Sometimes it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the indentation of knees in soil, the faint tang of iron in the air. Other times it lingered, impossible yet undeniable, its bell casting shadows though no light fell. Scholars attempting to trace its appearances grew mad with contradictions, their charts spiraling into circles, their dates looping upon themselves. One by one, their writings ended with the same line, "It is everywhere, and yet it is one." In this age, the distinction between witness and participant blurred beyond recall. To notice the sermon was to be shaped by it, to hear its rhythm was to carry it forward. The world itself had become a meeting house, each street a nave, each window a portal for its endless tolling. Those who resisted found their resistance hollow, for silence betrayed them most of all. In the hush between words, in the pause between breaths, the sermon waited, patient as stone, unbroken as time. And if the question remained of where it led, of what awaited the congregation at journey's end, no answer ever came, only the certainty that all who listened were already seated, already counted, already part of a story that had never ceased since the first toll rang in 1792. Thus the world bent, not by force, not by terror, but by cadence. It did not conquer, it absorbed. And within that vast absorption, every voice, every breath, every silence became another verse in a sermon without end, without mercy, without beginning. The ruin was no longer a place. It was the world entire, and the world entire bowed in rhythm, waiting, listening, unresisting. By the middle of the century's fourth decade, there remained no distinction between private and public, waking and dreaming, sacred and profane. The sermon threaded itself through every moment, so seamlessly that to imagine life without it became impossible. Even memory bent, reshaping itself into verses, until men and women struggled to recall events of their own past that were not spoken in cadence. Families sat together in silence, lips moving faintly, unaware of their own recitation. Workplaces hummed with rhythm instead of labor. Schools taught no arithmetic, no history, only the endless repetition of phrases whose origin none could claim yet all could speak. It was not law, not decree, but inevitability. The media of the world ceased to function as media at all. Films, books, songs, all dissolved into the same form. A novel would open with a sentence and close with the same, circling endlessly. A broadcast would collapse into rhythm after only a few words. Even music bent, melodies dissolving into a chant that pulled every listener into unison. And in that unison, there was no dissent, for dissent required silence, and silence no longer belonged to humanity. It belonged to the sermon, and the sermon alone. Witnesses spoke, if they could be called witnesses at all, of transformations too subtle to chart. A neighbor, once distinct, became indistinguishable from another, their words interchangeable, their gestures synchronized. Whole communities blurred together, not in appearance but in presence. To stand among them was to lose one's bearings, to feel oneself dissolve into their cadence, as though individuality had been but a temporary condition, now corrected. Those who attempted escape found only further gatherings, further voices, further pews stretching without boundary. It was no longer clear whether the ruin manifested around them, or whether the world had simply become the ruin. Governments, too, ceased their resistance. Where once officials issued decrees against investigation, against gatherings, they now spoke only in sermons themselves. Parliaments fell silent but for the tolling cadence. Armies marched no longer to orders but to rhythm. Nations no longer contended with one another, for all boundaries folded into the same congregation, a single audience listening to a voice both everywhere and nowhere. The bell tolled not at intervals but continuously, a vibration woven into the marrow of every living thing. And still, the ruin appeared, not diminished but multiplied. It was glimpsed on city streets, rising between buildings. It was glimpsed on oceans, floating though unmoored. It was glimpsed in dreams, in mirrors, in reflections upon water. Always the same crooked steeple, always the same heavy air, always the same pews filled with bowed heads. Some swore they had never traveled to Massachusetts, yet they had sat within those pews since childhood. Others claimed to have been born within its walls. In truth, the ruin was no longer bound to geography. It was the earth itself, the congregation infinite, the sermon endless. Those few who retained fragments of doubt lived in torment. They could still hear their own thoughts, faint, muffled beneath the cadence. They resisted with whispers, with gestures of individuality, with memories clutched tight. Yet even these betrayals dissolved swiftly. A whisper became a verse. A gesture fell into rhythm. A memory unfolded into sermon. And when at last their resistance failed, They joined with relief, as though exhaustion had lifted, as though they had at last remembered the words they were always meant to speak. No record remained outside the cadence. Libraries filled with scripture none had written. Archives looped upon themselves, every page the same, every photograph a blurred congregation. Digital records sang in rhythm when opened. Even the stars, some claimed, pulsed in sequence, their light flickering not in chance but in time with a tolling bell. The universe itself, they whispered, had joined the meeting house. And whether it had begun in 1792 or long before, whether it was born in Andover or had merely chosen that pulpit as its first visible form, no one could say. All that remained was the cadence, vast and consuming, eternal and unfinished. Thus the line between human and sermon dissolved. There were no longer listeners and word, no longer congregation and pulpit. There was only rhythm, unbroken, unresisting, unending. And in that rhythm, the last trace of individuality vanished like dust in a cathedral's light, leaving only the sound of a bell that no hand had rung, tolling without pause, forever, forever. By the middle years of the century, there was no horizon free of it. What had begun in a wooden meeting house in Massachusetts had swollen until it pressed against the edges of all perception. Astronomers, peering into the void, found the sermon inscribed in light. Pulsars that once marked time with impartial rhythm now fell into cadence too exact, too human, as if stars themselves had joined the congregation. Constellations bent subtly, their shapes warping into symbols unrecorded in any almanac. The heavens became another page of scripture, written not in ink or flame but in arrangement, as though creation itself turned its gaze toward the crooked steeple. Physicists, listening for the echo of the universe's birth, heard instead the toll of a bell rolling endlessly beneath cosmic noise. The signal lay deeper than background radiation, as if older than time itself, predating stars, predating matter, waiting for ears capable of hearing. Instruments adjusted for error only confirmed its clarity. Some researchers went mad in their observatories, scratching verses across the walls until the plaster crumbled. Others vanished altogether, leaving telescopes aimed at empty sky that now whispered with unceasing cadence. The earth groaned in sympathy. Mountains pulsed faintly, their stone trembling in rhythm no earthquake could mimic. Rivers bent their flow in time with syllables unheard, eddies circling as though stirred by invisible lips. Crops sprouted not at random but in lines too perfect, too uniform, like rows of kneeling bodies across the fields. Even the air seemed to breathe, gusts rising and falling in unison across vast plains, carrying the tang of salt and iron far from any shore. There was no silence left in nature, for nature itself had remembered the sermon and joined. Those who clung to individuality described waking to find their shadows multiplied, each one bending in cadence though their bodies did not. The ruin manifested openly now, colossal, its steeple taller than dunes. And still the bell tolled, not heard by ears but by marrow, by stone, by light itself. Whether Reverend Hale had spoken it first or merely uncovered what was always there, no one could say. His sermon had not ended because it had never begun. It was the cadence of existence itself, and now all creation bent to it. And in that immensity, where galaxies hummed in time and mountains bowed their peaks, the only question left was not whether the sermon would end, it could not, but whether anything had ever been outside it to begin with.